The moment I understood that I had cooked an entire Thanksgiving dinner for 5 people and would eat it alone, something inside my chest tightened in a way that felt unfamiliar because it was not anger and it was not shock, but a slow and painful recognition that I had become easy to forget. My name is Evelyn Harper. I am 63 years old, and for most of my life I believed that being dependable guaranteed love, that showing up without complaint guaranteed appreciation, and that if I continued giving even when I felt tired, the people around me would eventually protect my place in their lives. Thanksgiving had always been my responsibility, not because anyone demanded it openly, but because I accepted it year after year. And somewhere along the way, my effort stopped being celebrated and started being expected. I woke at 4 a.m. that day, with a quiet sense of purpose, tying my hair back and stepping into the kitchen while the world outside was still dark, seasoning the roasted herb chicken carefully with garlic and rosemary, stirring the mashed potatoes until they were smooth and soft, glazing the honey butter carrots until they shone under the kitchen light, and arranging fresh bread rolls inside warm linen so they would stay tender for when everyone arrived. I imagined them walking through the door. My husband, Thomas Harper, would take off his coat slowly and settle into his chair with familiar comfort, rarely noticing the hours of preparation behind the meal placed in front of him. My son, Michael Harper, would arrive with his phone still in his hand, distracted by work but offering a brief hug. That felt more routine than affectionate. His wife, Rachel Harper, would step inside politely, complimenting the smell of the house while maintaining the careful composure she always carried. My daughter, Caroline Brooks, would bring a bottle of wine she chose, quickly on the way over, smiling brightly, but already planning the next social engagement in her mind. Her husband, Daniel Brooks, would follow behind her quietly, offering a courteous greeting before blending into the background. They were the 5 people I had built this day around. They were the 5 people who once ran through this house as children and teenagers, and young adults who still needed guidance. By 2 p.m, the table was prepared with 5 plates placed evenly, 5 glasses polished, 5 folded napkins resting with intention, and I stood back to admire it because I still believed that effort mattered. At 2:15, I checked my phone, expecting a message saying they were on their way, but there was nothing waiting for me. At 2:42, a message arrived from Michael Harper explaining that work had become demanding and that he and Rachel Harper might not stay long, and I read the words slowly, hoping to find urgency between the lines, but there was none. I told myself that professional success requires sacrifice, and that I should not take it personally, but something inside me felt smaller than before. At 3:20, another message appeared from Caroline Brooks explaining that traffic was frustrating and that she and Daniel Brooks might stop by later in the evening instead of dinner time, and the casual tone of her explanation felt like a quiet dismissal of everything. I had been preparing since dawn. I stood in the kitchen holding my phone, staring at the glowing screen, and for a moment I felt foolish for having expected anything different. Thomas Harper walked into the room shortly after 4 and asked whether the food was ready because he was hungry, and his voice carried no concern about the empty driveway outside, no question about why no one had arrived yet, only a simple desire to eat. I told him we should wait a little longer, because Thanksgiving has always meant eating together, and I was not ready to let go of that meaning. By 5 o'clock, the roasted herb chicken had cooled and I returned it to the oven, brushing the skin gently so it would not dry, telling myself that delays happen, and that perhaps they would still surprise me. By 6 o'clock, the candles had burned low, and the mashed potatoes required reheating, and I stood in the dining room staring at the 5 chairs arranged around the table, and something inside me began to ache, in a way I had not felt before. No one was coming. There were no further messages. There were no apologies. There were no calls asking if I needed help or if I was waiting. The silence of the house felt enormous, pressing against my ears, reminding me that I had spent my entire day preparing for people who did not have time for me. Not because they were cruel, not because they were angry, but because I had slowly become optional. I placed food onto 5 plates anyway, because my hands moved automatically, even when my heart resisted, and I sat down at the head of the table, surrounded by empty chairs that seemed to accuse me of expecting too much. As I took my first bite of roasted chicken, the rosemary tasted sharper than before, and I felt tears gather without permission because I finally understood that this was not about one dinner. This was about growing older in a world that values productivity more than presence. This was about being the woman who once held everything together, and now waits quietly for attention that never arrives. This was about realizing that my children have schedules and priorities and ambitions, but none of them include protecting their aging mother from loneliness. I looked at the empty chair beside me where Thomas Harper should have been sitting, but he had already carried his plate into the living room to watch television, and the sound of distant commentary drifted down the hallway while I sat alone at a table meant for 5. I felt invisible. I felt unnecessary. I felt like a chapter in their lives that had already been completed. I finished my meal slowly, not because I was hungry, but because I needed to acknowledge the effort I had invested, and when I stood to clear the plates, I did not rush because rushing would suggest that this pain was temporary. It was not temporary. It was revealing. I washed 5 untouched plates and dried them carefully, and with every motion, I accepted a truth that hurt more than anger ever could. No one is too busy for what they truly value, and if they had time for everything except me, then perhaps I had misunderstood my importance for years. That night I sat alone in the quiet kitchen, long after the dishes were stacked and the lights dimmed, and I allowed myself to cry without hiding the sound, because I finally admitted something I had been afraid to face. I was not forgotten by accident. I was forgotten by comfort. They believed I would always be here. They believed I would always cook. They believed I would always wait, but something inside me shifted as the tears dried, and beneath the sadness there was a quiet awakening that felt stronger than grief. By next Thanksgiving, the meaning of this table would change, and this time, I would not be the one sitting alone. By next Thanksgiving, the meaning of that table would change, and for the first time in my life, I understood that change would not begin with confrontation, but with absence. The morning after I ate alone, the house felt strangely calm, as if it had already adjusted to the truth. I had only just accepted, and I moved through the kitchen without urgency, because there was no one expecting anything from me that day. Thomas Harper sat in his usual chair reading the newspaper, and he asked whether there were leftovers for breakfast, not because he intended harm, but because routine has always been more important to him than reflection, and I placed a container in front of him, without comment, because I was no longer interested in explaining what should have been obvious. He did not ask how I felt. He did not acknowledge that our children had not come. He did not suggest that perhaps something was wrong, and in that quiet indifference I felt a second awakening, one that was less emotional and more strategic. If my pain did not interrupt their comfort, then my silence would. Over the following weeks I began observing patterns I had ignored for years, noticing how often Michael Harper called only when he needed advice about taxes or home repairs, how Rachel Harper sent polite holiday messages but never asked about my health unless it was convenient, how Caroline Brooks shared photographs of vacations but rarely invited me to participate, and how Daniel Brooks remained distant, enough to avoid responsibility altogether. I realized that I had become a resource rather than a relationship. I had been the emergency contact, the holiday planner, the quiet financial supporter when small crises appeared, and the consistent emotional safety net that required no maintenance. And because I required no maintenance, I required no attention. That understanding did not make me angry. It made me clear. In January, I opened my old cedar chest and removed letters, photographs, and financial documents I had stored for decades, not because I planned to erase history, but because I needed to examine the structure of my present. Thomas Harper and I owned the house jointly, but the savings account that held most of our stability had been built from my careful budgeting, my part-time bookkeeping work, and the inheritance from my mother that I had never fully discussed with our children. For years I had intended that money to serve as security for everyone. Now I began reconsidering its purpose. I scheduled an appointment with a financial advisor without informing Thomas. Not out of secrecy, but out of necessity. Because for the first time I was evaluating my life independently rather than as an extension of others. Sitting in that quiet office, reviewing numbers that represented decades of discipline, I felt something unfamiliar rising inside me. Control. I was not powerless. I had simply behaved as though I was. The advisor explained that I could restructure assets, establish a trust, and allocate funds toward causes or personal goals without destabilizing my own security. And as he spoke, I realized that my future did not have to revolve around waiting for invitations. It could revolve around intention. That winter I stopped initiating weekly phone calls. I did not announce this decision. I simply observed what would happen if I allowed silence to exist without my intervention. Michael Harper did not call for 3 weeks. Caroline Brooks sent one message asking whether I had a recipe for a casserole she wanted to bring to a work event, and when I responded with brief instructions rather than enthusiasm, she did not follow up. Thomas Harper continued his routines as though nothing had shifted, watching television in the evenings, attending breakfast with his friends on Saturdays, rarely noticing that I had begun spending time in my study than beside him on the couch. The absence I created was subtle but deliberate. In March, I joined a local community education program that offered art and literature, courses for adults over 60, and on the first morning, I walked into that bright classroom, feeling both nervous and invigorated because it had been years since I entered, a space where my identity was not attached to motherhood or marriage. I introduced myself simply as Evelyn Harper, not as someone's wife or someone's mother, and that distinction felt surprisingly powerful. The instructor asked us to write about a moment that changed our perception of ourselves, and without hesitation I described the image of 5 untouched plates on a Thanksgiving table, explaining how silence can reveal truths that noise hides. As I read my words aloud, I felt emotion rise again, but this time it was not sorrow. It was recognition. Recognition that I had allowed myself to shrink in order to maintain harmony. Recognition that I had mistaken sacrifice for virtue. Recognition that growing older does not require disappearing. Over the following months, I developed routines that did not depend on my family's schedule. I volunteered at a literacy center twice a week. I began walking in the mornings than preparing elaborate breakfasts. I redecorated the guest bedroom into a small studio, space for writing and reflection. When Michael Harper called in April asking whether I could watch his house during a weekend trip, I told him I had prior commitments, and the silence that followed. My response was heavy with surprise. He had not considered that I might be unavailable. When Caroline Brooks suggested that I host Easter dinner as usual, I responded gently that I had plans to attend a retreat that weekend, and although she expressed mild disappointment, she did not offer to host it herself. Instead, the holiday passed quietly, and for the first time in years, I experienced celebration without exhaustion. Thomas Harper began noticing changes, in small ways. He asked why I was not cooking large Sunday meals anymore. He questioned why I was out of the house more frequently. He commented that I seemed distant. I did not argue. I did not accuse. I simply told him that I was learning to use my time differently. There is a difference between rebellion and recalibration, and what I was doing was not dramatic, but foundational. By summer, the house felt different. Not emptier, clearer. I no longer rushed to answer every message. I no longer offered financial assistance automatically. I no longer rearranged my schedule to accommodate last-minute requests. And slowly, subtly, the family dynamic shifted. Michael Harper began calling with slightly more politeness. Caroline Brooks visited briefly one afternoon and commented that I looked well-rested, as if my well-being were unexpected. Rachel Harper asked whether everything was all right because she sensed a change in tone, and I replied that everything was perfectly fine, which was both true and incomplete. In September, I finalized the restructuring of my assets, establishing a charitable trust dedicated to community education and literacy programs, allocating a significant portion of what my children had assumed would eventually become theirs toward a cause that reflected the value of effort and attention. I did not announce this decision. I did not threaten inheritance. I simply signed the documents, because love that depends on future reward is not love. It is investment, and I was no longer interested in being an asset. As autumn approached and store windows began displaying decorations for the upcoming holidays, I felt a calm determination that replaced the sadness of the previous year. I would not cook Thanksgiving dinner again. I would not prepare 5 plates in anticipation of attendance. I would not measure my value by who arrived. Instead, I made a reservation for a quiet coastal inn several hours away, planning to spend the holiday weekend surrounded by ocean air and strangers who expected nothing from me. I did not tell Thomas Harper immediately. I waited, because some realizations are more powerful when delivered without warning, and as November drew closer, I sensed that the same people who had once assumed my availability would soon confront a silence they did not anticipate. The year I stopped being available was not loud. It was deliberate, and by the time the leaves began falling from the trees, I understood something with absolute certainty. The next Thanksgiving would not belong to them. It would belong to me. The next Thanksgiving would not belong to them. It would belong to me. As November approached, I felt none of the anxious energy that had once defined this season, because for the first time in more than 40 years, I was not calculating grocery lists, polishing silverware, or adjusting oven temperatures to accommodate arrivals that may or may not occur. Instead, I confirmed my reservation at the Coastal Inn, overlooking the gray Atlantic shoreline, a place known for its quiet, elegance, and uninterrupted ocean views, a place where the only expectation placed upon guests was to rest. I waited until 1 week before Thanksgiving to mention my plans to Thomas Harper, not because I wanted to shock him, but because I needed him to experience the natural consequence of assumption. We were sitting at the kitchen table when he casually asked what time everyone would be arriving the following Thursday, and his tone carried the same unconscious certainty that had shaped every previous year, as if tradition were an automatic function rather than a deliberate effort. I looked at him calmly and explained that I would not be home for Thanksgiving because I had arranged to spend the weekend away, and the confusion that crossed his face was immediate and genuine, as though I had spoken in a language he did not understand. He asked who would cook. I answered that I did not know. He asked why I had not discussed this earlier. I told him that last year I had cooked for 5 people and eaten alone, and that this year I preferred not to repeat the experience. There was a silence between us that felt heavier than argument, because silence forces reflection in ways raised voices cannot. He said that the children would expect dinner. I replied that expectation is not the same as participation. He did not respond immediately, and for the first time in many years, I saw uncertainty in his posture. Later that evening, Michael Harper called to confirm arrival time for Thanksgiving, and when I informed him that I would not be hosting dinner this year, the pause on the other end of the line extended long enough to reveal surprise that bordered on disbelief. He asked whether everything was all right. I told him everything was perfectly fine. He suggested that perhaps I was overreacting to last year, and his choice of words exposed how little he had considered the depth of what happened. I explained that it was not about one dinner, but about recognition, and recognition cannot be demanded, only demonstrated. Caroline Brooks sent a message the following morning asking if I was serious about not hosting, and when I confirmed that I would be away, she replied, with a brief expression of inconvenience rather than concern. Neither of them offered to host dinner themselves. Neither of them suggested gathering elsewhere. Instead, they asked Thomas Harper whether he could prepare something simple, and he admitted that he did not know where to begin. The assumption that I would always manage the emotional architecture of our family had finally encountered resistance. On Thanksgiving morning, I packed a small suitcase with deliberate care, folding my clothes slowly, placing my journal and a novel inside the front pocket and glancing around, the house not with resentment, but with clarity. Thomas Harper stood near the doorway as I prepared to leave, and his expression carried a mixture of discomfort and contemplation that I had not seen before. He asked whether I truly intended to go. I told him yes. He asked whether I would return in time for dinner. I told him no. I drove away without anger, without guilt, without second thoughts. The road toward the coast was lined with late autumn trees stripped nearly bare, their branches reaching upward against a pale sky, and as I drove, I felt a sense of expansion that replaced the contraction I had experienced the year before. The inn was quiet when I arrived, the lobby warm with soft lighting and the distant sound of waves breaking against the shore. And I checked into my room feeling both unfamiliar and entirely myself. That afternoon I walked along the beach alone, the wind cool against my face, the ocean vast and indifferent in the most comforting way. And I realized that solitude chosen freely feels different from solitude imposed by neglect. As evening approached, I dressed simply and joined other guests in the dining room where a modest Thanksgiving meal was served without obligation or expectation, and I sat at a table beside strangers who spoke politely about travel and books rather than schedules and excuses. I tasted roasted chicken and warm bread and cranberry compote prepared by hands that did not know my history, and for the first time in decades, I experienced Thanksgiving without performance. Back at home, as I later learned, confusion had filled the house. Thomas Harper attempted to prepare a meal, but underestimated the coordination required. And Michael Harper arrived with Rachel Harper expecting the familiar aroma that had defined every previous year. Caroline Brooks and Daniel Brooks followed shortly after, surprised to find the dining table unset and the kitchen disorganized. They asked where I was. Thomas told them I had gone away for the holiday. The silence that followed, I was told later, felt uncomfortable and revealing. There was no polished table. There were no prepared dishes. There was no effortless structure holding the evening together. Michael Harper suggested ordering food from a nearby restaurant, and Rachel Harper agreed. But the delay stretched long enough that impatience surfaced, and the atmosphere shifted from casual expectation to awkward recognition. Caroline Brooks commented that she had assumed I would always handle Thanksgiving, and Daniel Brooks quietly acknowledged that perhaps they had taken that for granted. For the first time, they experienced the absence of what they had considered automatic. Meanwhile, I sat in my room, at the inn watching the moonlight reflect across the ocean surface, writing in my journal about the difference between being needed and being valued. My phone vibrated several times that evening. There were missed calls from Michael Harper. There was a message from Caroline Brooks asking whether I was safe. There was a brief message from Thomas Harper stating that dinner felt different without me. I did not respond immediately, not out of cruelty, but out of preservation, because the lesson was not about punishing them. It was about allowing them to experience reality without my intervention. The following day, I received another message from Michael Harper asking if we could speak when I returned. And for the first time in years, his tone carried humility rather than assumption. When I arrived home 2 days later, the house felt changed, not physically, emotionally. Thomas Harper greeted me with a seriousness that replaced his usual casual demeanor, and he admitted that Thanksgiving had been disorganized and uncomfortable, that the children had seemed unsettled, and that perhaps they had all relied too heavily on my consistency without acknowledging it. A few days later, Michael Harper and Caroline Brooks came to visit together, and their presence carried a weight that suggested reflection rather than routine. Michael admitted that he had not understood how much preparation Thanksgiving required, and Caroline confessed that she had assumed there would always be time to prioritize me later. I listened without interruption. I did not demand apology. I did not dramatize my pain. I simply explained that aging does not mean becoming invisible and that presence requires mutual effort. I also informed them calmly that I had restructured my estate to include significant charitable contributions toward community education initiatives because I wanted my legacy to reflect value placed on attention and effort. The surprise on their faces was immediate, and although I did not accuse them of loving money more than me, the unspoken awareness between us was undeniable. Love should not depend on inheritance, but appreciation should not depend on absence either. Over the following months, their behavior shifted subtly but noticeably. Phone calls arrived more frequently, without request. Visits were planned with intention, rather than convenience. Thomas Harper began participating in household responsibilities more actively, perhaps recognizing that partnership requires engagement rather than assumption. The transformation was not dramatic. It was steady. Respect replaced complacency. Acknowledgement replaced expectation. And the following year, when November approached once again, Michael Harper asked whether I would like to host Thanksgiving or whether he and Rachel Harper could organize it at their home. Caroline Brooks offered to prepare dishes in advance. Daniel Brooks volunteered to assist with planning. For the first time, the responsibility was shared rather than assigned. I agreed to attend, not because they expected it, but because they invited it. On that Thanksgiving, I did not wake at 4 a.m. I did not carry the weight of performance. I arrived as a guest at my son's home, where the table was set carefully and the roasted herb chicken was prepared by hands that had finally learned the effort behind tradition. As we sat down together, I looked around. The table at the same 5 people who once left me alone, and I saw something different in their expressions. Awareness, and awareness is the beginning of respect. I did not need revenge. I needed recognition. The year I stopped being available taught them what my presence had always meant. And this time, when I took my seat at the table, I was not invisible. I was valued. So I ask you, have you ever felt invisible in your own family? Do people only notice your value when you stop giving? Tell me honestly what would do if you were on my place.